Okay, so welcome to 53rd Annual and Scientific Congress of International Association of Art Critics, Aica, today. So we have 2 days program as webinar. So last year we realized an online international conference as Aica Turkey. And this year we are realizing our annual congress, the 53rd International Aica Congress, titled Intellectual Aftermath, as a webinar. So let me sum up the opening program. So we will share the video by Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves, our president of Aica. And then I will try to sum up this year's Congress for you. And then I'll give the floor to Beral Madra, the honorary president of Aica Turkey. And then I'll give the floor to Günsel Renda, the distinguished prize she has for this year as 2021 Aica Award winner. So before we'll share the video by Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves, let me introduce her to you. Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves, now the Aica president in the term 2020 and 2023. He has a bachelor degree in social science from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, master and PhD in art sociology from the same university, full professor now at the Art and Communication School of USP, and guiding MA and PhD students in the arts area. She's working in 2 postgraduate programs at USP, also the postgraduate program of Aesthetics of Art History, and in the research segment of Fundamentals of Art Criticism, and the postgraduate program of Integration of Latin America in the research segment of Communication and Culture. She's currently presiding the postgraduate program of Integration of Latin America, director of the Contemporary Art Museum of the University of Sao Paulo from 1994 to 1998, and from 2006 to 2010. She's been for 2 terms the vice president of Aica from 2007 and 2009 and 2010 to 2012. Now she is the president of Aica, and also she's been president of APCA, the Brazilian Association of Art Critics, for 12 years. Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves has been organizing for more than 20 years exhibitions and participating as a jury member in national and international commissions, and she published many books and articles in specialized magazines since 1975. So let's watch the video that Lisbeth sent us. Sorry for that because of the time zone. So Özlem, I think we will share the video, the opening speech by our president of Aica.
Unmute together.
Sorry, but we don't hear anything.
Is there a problem on the voice?
There is no voice.
Give me 1 second, please.
Yeah. And I think you have to switch the microphone settings, I think.
Sorry for this technical problem. I'm trying to fix this.
Yeah, sure.
Dear President of Aica Turkey, Sinan Eren Erk. Dear Beral Madra, Honorary President of Aica Turkey. Dear Firat Arapoglu, former President of Aica Turkey, responsible for the organization of the 53rd Aica Congress together with Aica International. Ladies and gentlemen, present at the opening of this international Congress. Annual Aica Congresses are very important in Aica's life. They project up-to-date questions in the field of art and society, and we can say they are milestones for the Aica worldwide membership and the art establishment at large. This is a reason for Aica's commitment to annual congresses. We hold with great satisfaction our 53rd Congress in Istanbul, a Congress that was impeccably organized by the Turkish chapter of Aica under the coordination of Firat Arapoglu, together with the Aica Congress Committee. The theme suggested for the debate, Intellectual Aftermath, brings to us a fundamental matter of the current days. COVID-19 and its impacts on the society and all the sphere of our lives, including cultural life. Some questions proposed by this Congress are precisely, how will current crisis completely reshape our life? Will humanity be able to repair its structures, or will they have to be rebuilt? We already know that the pandemic is one of the main events that in the present century has caused profound global implications since the turn of the millennium. Discussion is necessary on this point. But the event has other proposals. The Congress opens the discussion to other directions, focusing on problems in social, political, and economical life. As Firat Arapoglu observed in an interview given to Aica Brazil Online newspaper, it is necessary to focus on other important points of our time: climate crisis, political dilemmas, global terrorism threat, wars, religious conflicts, the refugee situation, gender discussions, besides pandemics. These are among the foremost subcategories of this aftermath. And for him, as organizer of the Congress, and for all of us as well, it is important that the event explores what is the role of the art theory and criticism in the understanding of the intellectual aftermath and the shaping of this state of change. It will be a privilege to hear our invited speakers and the researchers from different backgrounds and different parts of the world to know their thoughts. The program shows us the presence of 3 guest speakers and 15 researchers from different countries such as Hungary, Denmark, China, Turkey, Taiwan, Costa Rica, United Kingdom, Sweden, Canada, Netherlands, Lebanon, and Brazil. It is not an easy task to organize an online international congress in a pandemic moment. I would like to appreciate the efforts of Firat Arapoglu and Aica Turkey. I'm sure this Congress will bring us an extraordinary contribution about these crucial subjects of the existing times. I'd like to welcome all the speakers and the audience that will be with us throughout these 2 days of work. Thank you. I wish you all an excellent meeting.
So I would like to thank to Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves for the opening speech for our 53rd Congress as Aica President of Aica International President. So in this case, let me try to sum up the Congress for you. So first of all, this opening speech must have been done by Sinan Eren Erk, who is the actual Aica president of Turkey for this term, but his father has a problem, so he must be taking care of him. So we wish a speed recovery for him. So as Aica vice president of this term also, let me try to introduce our Congress to you. The 53rd Aica Congress Intellectual Aftermath is supported by Aica Committee of Congress. Our aim at this Congress is to evaluate some ranges of concepts and explore their social and political implications by asking questions such as how will current crisis completely reshape our lives? Or as Lisbeth reminded us, will humanity be able to repair its structures, or will it have to rebuild? What role will art theory, practice, and criticism play from a political, economic, social, psychological, or cultural perspective for helping us to understand the intellectual outcome and to shape the current change process? So can art and culture become independent of economic criteria and ideologies if they become key elements in a new socio-political discourse? Or is it the inevitable fate of art and its consumers to be consumed and destroyed by the system? Because 21st century is becoming a century of collapse, we can say. Humanity's increasingly desperate efforts to control nature and the other in the last century are backfiring. As the political discourse has become increasingly harsh, the redistribution of wealth has become even more disproportionate. As stated in the open call text to all around the world, the Y2K error threatening all digital systems, the subprime mortgage crisis that brought the United States to the brink of collapse, and the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, or North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and Australia's wildlife massive forest fires, and the recent COVID-19 outbreak, which has spread to the world from a city, is just a few of the events that have had profound global implications since the turn of the millennium. So in this context, we welcomed suggestions from researchers from different backgrounds, and as it seems to us, it was essential to hear their thoughts and also the thoughts by our invited speakers. So we have 3 invited speakers for this Congress. Our Congress consists of 15 researchers from different world countries, such as Hungary, Denmark, China, Turkey, Taiwan, Costa Rica, United Kingdom, Sweden, Canada, Netherlands, and Brazil. And one of the invited speakers, writer, translator, and educator from Beirut, Raya Badran. She will talk about the Beirut's artistic and cultural landscape. And the dear professor at the Chambers will deliver his speech titled Writing Art Criticism in the Age of Black Lives Matter. And Professor Hilary Robinson will share her thoughts on contemporary theory, art, and gender. We would like to thank these three invited speakers by accepting our offer, and they will join us. In the first of the four session panel, we will discuss trauma and trauma aesthetics, art criticism in crisis and hyperreality, NFT, art and markets, art and identity and science fiction in the era of ecological crisis, and also women artists, criticism, art institutions, and violence in the public space and photography, and the post-truth and spread, art in the pandemic era and post-pandemic art. So the current situation, which puts the heavy burden of the last century on our shoulders and increases the imbalances in the existing order, was conceptualized as an intellectual aftermath by us. This term expresses the devastation caused by our acceptance of the supremacy of reason in the name of scientific and technological progress. So this title suggests ways to compensate for it based on postmodern thought. In this respect, we think that different approaches to contemporary art have tried to map the changes that have taken place in how art is made, realized, and exhibited since the 1960s. We believe that these developments do indeed lend a spatial principle to their contextual or relational qualities. And accordingly, we assume that understanding how artists relate to and work with space becomes a fundamental, if not very important, issue. So, in connection with how contemporary art works with society's space or spatial dimensions, forms and tools originally unique to geography have become fundamental tools of contemporary art. So many of the events we have witnessed in the last 2 decades are unlike anything we have seen before. So at this Congress, the 53rd International Aica Congress, we try to aim to examine the concept of intellectual aftermath, the primary condition of our age, through the lens of art, and explore possible new horizons for the future. So you can access the Congress documents through Aica, www.aicaturkey.org, or our Aica International website. So in this Congress, we would like to thank Aica International for supporting us, and also I would like to thank newly elected board of Aica Turkey for all their invaluable effort to organize this Congress. Thank you very much. So, and also, let me remind, we would like to thank the Aica Congress Committee, the chair of Aica Congress Committee, Liam Kelly, and other important members. So at this case, let me give the floor to our honorary president of Aica Turkey, dear Beral Madra. So Beral Madra, if it's okay for you, let me give the floor to you.
Thank you, Fırat. It's an important day for Aica Turkey and for all Aica International, Global Aica International. Dear Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves, President of Aica International, and all the board members, dear Global Aica Presidents, boards and members, and dear online participants, please allow me to greet specially 2 of my friends and honorary presidents of Aica International, namely Jacques Leinhardt and Henry Mary Hughes, to whom we owe the re-establishment of Aica Turkey in 2003. I would like to thank both to the former president Fırat Arapoğlu and his board, and the current president Sinan Erenerk and his board for their precious contribution to the Congress and to Aica Turkey's global presence. Aica Turkey is organizing the 53rd Aica International Congress with the cooperation of Aica International and with the very zeitgeistlich team of intellectual aftermath. I underline zeitgeistlich because we are facing now an intellectually, mentally, spiritually seamless doppelganger universe or a virtual world called metaverse. Intellectual aftermath is the key concept for the near future. I will not mention here the global COVID-19 aftermath. We are experiencing it in full impact since 2 years. The concept text of the Congress extensively describes the reason, content, and aims of this team. In my position, after 40 years of activity in art and culture in Turkey, I feel lucky to be able to work in this field. And I think that we all, the intellectual, with all the intellectual and visual production created by the artists, I could contribute to the quest of democracy, intellectual endeavor, freedom of expression in Turkey. Now, inexplicable wars, political and economic turmoil, massive migrations, and human tragedy are happening in our region. In fact, not only in our region, but also on the borders of European Union. Since decades, and the culture, art, and intellectual endeavors is obviously affected in many ways, despite the individual and community-based efforts for a better life and for sustainability of culture. Political restrictions, financial deficits, populisms, religious decrees, obscurantist social behaviors have paved a thorny path for creative generations and intellectuals in many ways in the regions of in this region and in many regions of this world. However, resistance also became more significant than before. The artists and art experts are marching forward into the global visibility with a rich portfolio of political, economic, social, and cultural interpretations, statements with projects dealing with global problems, with manifestos and other creative tools. The global art and culture system and policies, restructured from the 90s on in many democratic countries, requires real investment in intellectual expansion, progressive ideas, concepts, and creative visions that are the cause of existence of culture and art institutions. The main goal is that artists, art experts of all institutions or independent people, critical and progressive prospective projects should be promoted and supported internationally. I will underline the current reality. The political and economic structural difference between the progressive democracies and the mutilated democracies, which creates difference in progress and sustainability, if not polarization, need to be immediately considered. As a powerful global NGO, I think we have the responsibility and power to invite the governments to put this reality into their agenda and restructure their policies. Currently, these are the main strategies to be invested in. I will mention these strategies, which should be in the policies of political parties, governments. First, there is an online intellectual information and communication flow between two distinct entities. I mean, progressive democracies and mutilated democracies. But there is still inefficient exchange of intellectual investments, activities, and other events. This should be considered. There is still an ongoing curiosity in the production of the other, even if the other is still the breeding ground of discrimination and racism all over. There is an interested audience, but it needs to be well informed about the necessity of intellectual and creative productions. There is all over a governmental distance to contemporary art and its production possibilities, so that our communities should continuously communicate and collaborate with political parties and governments. There are many European Union institutions and funds that can be applied for realization of mutual projects, which is apparently the only positive development. But this should be empowered. There are individual curatorial works in the fringes of the mainstream that need to be considered as activities to be supported. I hope all these objectives and all these strategies can be realized and can be supported and can be empowered, especially in our region. I wish you all pleasant, successful, profitable, rewarding online meeting. Let us look forward to a natural, healthful, and joyful future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your speaking, dear Beral Madra, our honorary president of Aica Turkey, and also she opened up our section in 2003. So since then, we've been trying to organize such events, and also we've been trying to give voice for the inequality in the art world since then. Thank you very much for your speaking. And then let me come to the point that our distinguished prize session. So we have, as Aica International, we have an awards committee. So the committee members, who is the chair, is present now, Jean Bandi from United States of America, and also other members, Lisbeth Rebello Goncalves and Adriana Almada from Paraguay, and Luciana Garces from Brazil, and Susanna Sulic from France, and Magdalena Ujma from Poland. So the Aica Awards Committee's mission is to identify and promote diverse forms of independent art criticism around the world in a way which reflects Aica's global membership and ambitions. So for this year, this prize, the distinguished contribution to art criticism, we would like to give this prize to dear Professor Dr. Günsel Renda. So let me share her resume with you, and then I will give the floor to dear Professor Günsel Renda. So Günsel Renda is professor of art history and studied at Barnard College in Columbia University and Washington University in USA. She has taught at Hacettepe University in Ankara and chaired the Department of History of Art for many years. So she's presently teaching at the Department of Archaeology and History of Art at Koç University in Istanbul, and also acting as advisor to Pera Museum. She has served as advisor to the Ministry of Culture and organized several international exhibitions. She was also a guest professor at École Pratique Sorbonne in Paris. She has lectured on Turkish art in the United States and several countries in Europe and Asia, and has participated in many international research projects and is the recipient of several awards. Professor Renda specializes in Ottoman painting, late Ottoman art, and interactions of European and Ottoman culture. She has written many articles in Turkish and English in various journals on these topics and is the author or co-author of the several books. Some of the books she edited, co-edited, and wrote are The Transformation of Culture, the Atatürk Legacy, with Korte Peter and Princeton in 1986, and History of Turkish Painting with Grabar and Adnan Turani and Kaya Özsezgin in 1988, and Women in Anatolia, 900 Years of the Anatolian Woman in 1994, The Sultan's Portrait picturing the House of Osman with Necipoğlu, Rabi, Majer, Meyer Zulkapellen, Bağcı, and Mahir in 2010, The Ottoman Civilization with Halil İnalcık in 2002, Minnet of Constantinople, and another publication by her in Stockholm in 2003, An Image of the Turks in the 17th Century Europe in 2005, and The Book of Felicity in 2007, and Osmanlı Resim Sanatı in Turkish and English, Ottoman Painting, with the contribution of Serpil Balcı, Filiz Çağman, and Zeren Tanındı between the period 2007 and 2019. So, with the permission of Jean Bandi, who is the chair of the committee, awards committee, let us give the floor to Professor Dr. Gürsel Renda, who is the Distinguished Art Prize she has for this year in our Congress.
Well, thank you very much to all colleagues today. And I certainly would like to extend my thanks to Aica Award Committee for honoring me with the Aica Award. And I thought, as one of the earliest members of Aica in Turkey and as an art historian, I should say a few words about the significance of Aica for Turkish art historiography. Aica Turkey, these may be familiar to some of our members in Turkey, but Aica Turkey was founded by late Professor Suud Kemal Yetkin and well-known artist Nurullah Berk in 1954. They were already members of Aica International, and at the fourth meeting of Aica in Dublin in 1953, they were able to persuade the committee to hold the fifth Congress in 1954 in Istanbul with the theme Interactions of Western and Eastern Art. And actually, as an academic, Professor Yetkin's aim was to establish a multidisciplinary approach to fine arts education in Turkey to include aesthetics and art criticism, leading to more conceptual approaches in art history. And and actually his academic careers in several universities in Turkey initiated a more multidisciplinary approach to art history, including aesthetics and atelier work, to give the students the opportunity for creative work as well. And my membership in Aica was realized through him, whom I had the opportunity to work with, founding the Department of Art History at Hacettepe University in Ankara, setting a multidisciplinary curriculum. And looking back at the history of formal art education in Turkey in the past, certainly reveals that the interest in cultural heritage of course, had already started during Ottoman times with the establishment of the museums, the first archaeological museum in 1881 and Fine Arts Academy found for formal art education in 1883, and in addition to fine arts education, art historical research was carried on with publications and special emphasis on cultural heritage and traditional handicrafts. In the Republican period after 1923, art historical research became a part of the cultural and educational reforms to prove the presence of Turkish culture and arts competitive with Western models based on cultural elements from Turkic Asia to Mediterranean cultural heritage, and art education had to be extended to the public through museums and exhibitions. In 1936, an exhibition on contemporary art, half a century of Turkish painting and sculpture, was held at Fine Arts Academy, and it defined modern art during the early years of the Republic and led to the establishment of the present Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture in the Dolmabahce Palace. Now, formal art education, art historical education in the universities started as a part of the cultural reform, and the contributions of initially of German and Austrian professors then invited to teach at the universities initiated a more formalist methodology in art historical research, followed by Turkish art historians in various, in the art Department of Art History in various universities. This formalist research methodology was based on documentation, dating, stylistic analysis. Of course, that was needed for art historical research in Turkey at the time. And they did initiate research in Turkish art, documenting many unknown monuments, art objects all over the country, initiating systematic museum studies and methodology for field work and in various parts of the country. But a new definition of Turkish art had evolved now. Turkish art across a vast geographic area, stretching from Central Asia to the Balkans. It replaced the term Turkish Islamic art, which had come to be used before. But following the formalistic methodology, research carried on in the Turkish universities and museums have provided, of course, inventories for the unknown objects and undated monuments, and actually fieldwork, excavations, and joint projects were carried on. However, congresses and exhibitions were needed to be organized, promoting research on Turkish art in Turkey and in other countries. Therefore, the Aica meeting in Turkey as early as 1954, followed by the first International Congress of Turkish Art in 1959, also organized by Professor Yetkin, was held every 4 years in various countries, paved the way for a more interdisciplinary methodology for Turkish art historiography. And these congresses enlarged the scope of research on Turkish art in a wider geography, including research by scholars in different countries on interactions of European and Turkish art and developments on contemporary art and art criticism. One other source for deeper research in Turkish art has been, of course, the exhibitions of Turkish art in Turkey and traveling exhibitions in foreign countries. And some of these exhibitions have turned into international projects with the contribution of Turkish and foreign scholars. They have increased with the establishment of private museums, in Turkey, such as Saat Berkanım, Sakıp Zabancı Pera, Rahmi Koç museums, as well as Istanbul Modern, indicating the significant role of curators. To this should be added exhibitions of modern Turkish art, and especially those retrospective exhibitions of earlier artists and sculptors that require, through documentation and scholarly thorough documentation and scholarly interpretations. And even more significant have been the activities such as the biennials organized by the Istanbul Cultural Foundation, bringing latest movements to the Turkish artistic world. What is now needed is supplementing the formalistic methodology with more historical documentation, sociological and anthropological analysis, leading to more interdisciplinary studies and conceptual, theoretical and conceptual conclusions. Therefore, the intellectual aftermath entitling our meeting certainly defines the search for more conceptual and multidisciplinary methodologies in art historiography today and in the future, especially in today's political, social, and economic circumstances, which were certainly clearly defined by Beral Madra's talk today. And I would like to end with the words of late Professor Suud Kemal Yetkin, founder of Aica, today as an art historian. Art is a creative action evoking excitement and aesthetic feeling. Art is both personal and social. Art blends thinking, action, and creativity. Thank you very much. You don't need to explode. This is just a, reminder of the, history of Aica in Turkey, because that's how I belong in the organization and trying to fight for these interdisciplinary approaches to art history, I should say, art historiography. Yes.
Thank you very much for your speaking, dear Professor Yünsel Renda, and let us congratulate you for this distinguished prize. And also we would like to thank you for all your contribution to the history of art and history of Turkish art in an interdisciplinary way. So thank you very much. And now let's go on for our first session, who under the moderation of our colleague Elif Dastarlı Dellaloğlu. And in the first session, before the first session, also the keynote speaker, the dear Raya Badran, will deliver her speech to us. So we can start, I think, in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much for joining us for the opening speech, and then please stay in the webinar. And then we will go to the first keynote speaker's speech in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Sorry, do we have a break time or just we start? What's your opinion? Right, maybe. The program is because showing us.
So we have just around 5
later.
minutes. Yeah, so
Okay.
we can start in a couple of minutes, I think.
Okay. Okay. We can start now, I suppose. Hello, everyone. Welcome to 53rd International Aica Congress about Intellectual Aftermath. We are in the first session today here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elif Dastarlı. I'm the member of Aica Turkey since 2010. I will be moderating this session. But before we begin, just a quick note, please mute yourself during the meeting to keep the quality of sound functional, of course. And if you have any questions, please type them into chat box. We will have time for questions at the end. I'll bring them up after presentations. First, I'd like to briefly introduce our keynote speaker, Raya Badran. She's a writer based in Beirut. She earned her MA in Oral and Visual Cultures from Goldsmith College, London in 2008. Her first publication entitled Radiophonic Voices was published by Ashkal Alvan during Homeworks 5 in 2010. Her writing primarily focuses on the intersections between theory, fiction, and sound, and has published articles and text in Peeping Tom, Bidon, Ibraz, Arte East, Global Art Forum publications. She recently collaborated with 98 Weeks Project Space as a sound editor for the radio project. Our lines are now open in the framework of Homework 6. She's going to talk about Beirut Breath, notes on the cultural and artistic landscape of Beirut. Please, over to you, Madam Raya Badran. Yeah. Please unmute yourself first.
Sorry. Thank you, Elif, for the introduction, and thank you to the Aica team and to Dr. Ebru Yetishkin for extending the invitation to come and talk at this Congress. I'm very happy to be included with such distinguished guests and speakers, and I very much look forward to the contributions today and to our discussion. So the title of this talk takes its title from an exhibition and its catalog, Beirut Bereft, the Architecture of the Forsaken and Map of the Derelict, that gathered the photographic work of Lebanese artist and photographer Ziad Antar, accompanied with a text by Lebanese curator and writer Rasha Zalti. Presented in the framework of the Sharjah Biennial in 2009, the book features Antar's series of photographs depicting Beirut's derelict and abandoned buildings erected in the 1950s onwards, whose construction was interrupted, but whose presence in the city as carcasses, as Salti calls them, appears to stop time, but in fact anchors us in what Lebanese artist and writer Walid Sadiq calls the protracted now of the civil war. I return to these various images and texts from distinct temporalities at a particularly painful juncture in the city's history. In fact, the past 2 years compelled me to return to specific writings and artworks by Lebanese authors and artists that have been produced in the past 2 decades in an effort to provide, mostly for myself, an understanding of our present condition in Lebanon and its art world, and if to think whether the time we are living now constitutes an aftermath to begin with. I could feel the pull of these artists' words and images as the world quite literally disintegrated outside my window, even if I am now relearning how to read them. In many ways, Beirut has become unrecognizable to its residents, a carcass of what it was once before the rapid disintegration of its economy and financial market and the fracture of its social fabric. To give context to my readings of the current state of artistic production and the institutions that support it, I feel it is necessary to evoke, albeit briefly, what exactly has happened in the past 2 years. Since the summer of 2019, Lebanon began to plunge in the worst economic and financial collapse of its history, and according to a recent report from the World Bank last May, one of the most brutal financial meltdowns in the world since 1850. In just 2 years, Lebanon's currency, which had been pegged to the US dollar since 1997 by the central bank, has now devaluated by more than 90% in the open market, further weakening the state's already precarious public infrastructures and expenditure. The causes behind this financial crisis are due to the fact that the central bank lended money from local banks to pay off debts, while it increased its reserves with US dollars sent by expatriates and foreign aid in a futile attempt to decrease the price of imports and maintain the currency stability. By the summer of 2019, those reserves had depleted considerably. In his succinct text that overviews the severity of the financial situation since well before 2019, writer and anthropologist Stefan Tarnowski remarked that, quote, "Today, the scheme looks very much like the closing stages of a Ponzi scheme. COVID-19 and the explosion at the port of Beirut last August were only the latest shocks to a system that was already beyond rescue," end of quote. The central bank, which also oversees the purchase of imports from its reserves and on which Lebanon relies very heavily on, started to lift subsidies on vital goods such as fuel, medicine, and a plethora of other goods. Unsurprisingly, and in such a short time, the central bank's ability to pay for the subsidies became impossible, which culminated this summer in an acute shortage of fuel and diesel, forcing thousands of citizens to line up near gas stations to fill up their tanks. Electricity hours have become so scarce. We receive power perhaps 1 or 2 hours per day by the official state electricity. In fact, the power is gone now, that most of us resort to private neighborhood generators, which do not have the fuel capacity to be on for extended, uninterrupted hours per day. And so literal darkness befell on the entire country and its capital only a year after the catastrophic Beirut port explosion, which took place on August 4 to 2020. This deadly disaster wiped out entire neighborhoods of the city, killing more than 200 people, injuring thousands, and forcing more than 300,000 people outside of their homes. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the state was again non-existent, leaving us to fend for ourselves and tend to those who suffered irrevocable loss. In the days, weeks, and months following the explosion, thousands of volunteers flocking from different parts of the capital and other regions in Lebanon evacuated and tended to the wounded, wiped the streets clean, evacuated residential buildings, offices, and studios, restaurants, museums, galleries, art spaces, and studios. Instead of receiving an apology by the government for the disaster, we were met with rubber bullets and live ammunition on August 8th, only 4 days after the city was decimated, when we descended on the streets with rage. The investigation into the explosion remains inconclusive because it is continually hampered by the same political class of former warlords and cunning businessmen that have been ruling the country for the last 3 decades, and after they seized power in the aftermath of the Lebanese Civil War. The Ta'if Agreement in 1990 officially ended the civil war and effectively amnestied the leaders of the parties who waged it. For the most part, it has been an utterly relentless time for those who survived both the explosion and the financial collapse of the country. While we are no strangers to death, having survived the civil war and dodged the numerous assassinations that gripped the country since the early 2000s, one could argue that we do nothing but survive. In his essay titled "Peddling Time When Standing Still, Art Remains in Lebanon and the Globalization That Was," written in 2011, artist and writer Walid Sadeh presents a critique of the role of post-Civil War contemporary artists in the international circuits of contemporary art, which provided them with the stage to become more than mere survivors, as Sadiq explains. He writes that, quote, by 2003, one could speak of an inflation of contemporary Lebanese art. The contradictions were conspicuous. Lebanese art was marking the calendar of the global art circuit at a time when the socio-political situation in the country was regressing alarmingly. Artists, it seemed, could do nothing except carry on the trend of divulging the local to the international audience. End of quote. It is not a coincidence that Sadiq employs the jargon of finance to describe the rise and wide circulation of artists from Lebanon in the globalized market in those years, at the cusp of the millennium. Drawing from the writings of Bilal Khbez, a Lebanese poet, essayist, essayist and artist who was forced into exile in 2008 on the stakes of such a divulgement under globalization, which for Sadiq does not result in a confession, as well as Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of the chronotope, which analyzes the unity of time and space of narratives in literature. Sadiq expounds on the role of such survivors in the aftermath of wars and internal political instability. For the artist, quote, open quote, the local and regional conditions which had propelled these artists into the circuits of the global art market came tumbling down following the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri on February 14, 2005. And then later during and after the attempted Israeli annihilation of Hezbollah in Lebanon during the summer of 2006. First, the centrality of the capital Beirut and its reconstruction project, which stood for artists as a referent and nourished their critiques and claims, was severely undone. Second, the Pax Hariri, which had maintained the myth of economic growth during the 1990s by brokering a tense but operative truce with the military force of Hezbollah in South Lebanon, was annulled. Even if the global art market, ever eager for new information and topical events, continues to host the work of Lebanese artists, it is nevertheless crucial to state that it does so against a very different background. Sadiq employs Bakhtin's literary chronotope because of its ability to merge space and time in a novel, but most importantly because time becomes concrete and impregnates the places in which events unfold. It is in this materialization of time and the belatedness of its representation of an event that Sadiq finds relevance in the chronotope within the context of Lebanon, because Bakhtin's chronotope, quote, allows for a model by which to gauge the crisis in which we live, end of quote. For Sadiq, who has dedicated much of his writing and artistic practice to the labor of missing and the role of the witness in a state of protracted civil war in Lebanon, what remains crucial is for artists to propose and occupy a habitable chronotope that is able to question the quandary of life under the control of two conflicting conceptions of time. The two opposing conceptions of time that Sadiq refers to here were the ones imposed by Hezbollah and its opponent, the Future Movement, a party created by the defunct Rafiq Hariri in the years after his assassination. The former's was the time of indefinite anticipation of Israeli attacks, while the latter's was the time of the future promise of and eventual release from the truth behind the assassination of the Prime Minister and founder of the party. Sadiq argues that those who found themselves outside of these two conceptions cannot claim time as theirs. And while the current political terrain might appear to be different from what it was when this essay was written a decade ago, one can argue that we remain in the same predicament, beleaguered by conceptions of time that are no longer ours. There was, however, a moment, albeit brief, when we felt like we were able to impose our own conception of time during the October 17 uprisings, when hundreds and thousands of people across Lebanon erupted in mass protests against the entire ruling class and the bank owners it protected. The centrality of Beirut as a site of protest and dissent was also broken then. The fact that the uprisings were often more forceful, more animated in their anger towards the state in the different cities and regions of Lebanon was unprecedented, but also unsurprising, since the government had neglected them the most in the last decades. The slogan, which was chanted in the protests for several months, "Kullun yani kullun," all of them means all of them, was perhaps the sole indicator of our time, which was no longer shackled by what the ruling parties imposed on us. Although Sadiq would caution against the sentiment of hope, which was felt and articulated during the protests, and which he regards as a hindrance to collective action in the present, the protests did seem like it stopped what Sadiq called the protracted now of the ruling political parties. Artists and various cultural workers felt the pull of the raging streets, and like many actors in civil society, they participated in the formation of groups, informal groups, which attempted to articulate modes of discourse that espoused what writer and curator Edwin Nasser called the insurrectionary fervor of the protests. It was now time, it seemed, for the artists and cultural workers and the art organizations that supported artistic production during the decades of borrowed time to take a look inwards and contend more urgently with the wider structural questions related to sources of funding and sustainability, which always loomed large over art organizations and spaces. But this time, the debates no longer centered on the precariousness of the sector and its dependence on funding and its quest for sustainability. Rather, they focused on the relations between these spaces, that entertained relations with people close to power and against whom they protested. So, from rich donors to bankers to other people who kind of contribute financially to the artistic sector. What is noteworthy is that these burgeoning debates, while important and urgent, took place in informal meetings and correspondences, but never really materialized into calls to action to this day. It would be a mistake to fault the heterogeneous sector and its actors whose vested interests in the field of arts and culture are also diverse for not having continued these debates or actions during the collapse of the country, but it is perhaps symptomatic of the role that critique occupies in a time when articulating voices of dissent from within these intergenerational groups is crucial to its perseverance. But before we can understand the critical stances on the level of discourse that took place during the protests and which unfortunately came to a halt with the arrival of the pandemic and the successive crises from which the country now suffers, one must go further back to chart the complex terrains of art and culture in Lebanon in the last few decades, during which, of course, the Lebanese contemporary artists that Sadiq refers to practiced and divulged. Like many potentially generative sectors in Lebanon, arts and culture were never given priority by the successive Lebanese governments post-Ta'if. State funding of the arts was non-existent and will, I suspect, remain as such in the coming years. The many non-commercial art spaces, organizations, institutions, and collectives in Lebanon operating in the field were able to foster a critical and engaging artistic community composed of local, regional, and international artists for more than 20 years, and have worked through turbulent periods of financial instability and weathered periodic outbursts of violence and political turmoil. While a great number of Beirut's internationally recognized artists began their practices in the early 1990s in the aftermath of the Lebanese Civil War, which spanned 15 years, public institutions or exhibition spaces dedicated to cultural and artistic practices were scarce during the decade following the end of the war. One of the few and oldest nonprofit organizations that started in those days is Ashkal Alwan, the Lebanese Association for Plastic Arts, which was created by a group of artists and art enthusiasts in 1993. One other noteworthy organizations whose activities did not exclusively promote contemporary art, but also photography, cinema, the performing arts, and cultural practices, like the Arab Image Foundation, NEA Beirut, Beirut DC, Zico House, and Espace SD, were created before or at the cusp of the new millennium, just as the inflation of Lebanese art began. In 2009, the Beirut Art Center, a non-commercial exhibition space, opened in Beirut. This was significant because none of the aforementioned organizations had substantial spaces of their own to exhibit or implement their diverse programs. Writers and scholars argued that this state of affairs actually helped create an environment in which self-described alternative modes of art and knowledge production were non-institutional or proto-institutional came to the fore. When it opened in 2009, the Beirut Art Center was the only organization where artists, writers, curators, researchers, musicians, and students could regularly attend the center's exhibition and programs showcasing international, regional, and local contemporary artists. The center also hosted a number of other institutions, festivals, exhibitions, and fora, such as Ashkal Alwan's homeworks. The Nikola Ibrahim Surso Museum is the oldest and perhaps the only art museum proper. The former Lebanese collector and promoter of the arts, Nikola Ibrahim Surso, a member of Beirut's historical elite social class, bequeathed his mansion and collection to the state in 1952 when he died. The museum opened officially in 1961 with the Salon d'Automne, which runs to this day. In 2008, it underwent major renovations and expansion works and reopened in 2015 under a new mission and direction. I think it's worth noting also that the Surso Museum sustained incredible damage during the August 4 explosion, and many of the work on restoring this very old historic museum basically were blown up. In 2016, Dar al-Nimr for Arts and Culture opened in the Clemenceau neighborhood by Rami Nimr, a Lebanese Palestinian banker and collector of Islamic and Palestinian art. The center was for a time primarily concerned with historical, modern, and contemporary visual arts hailing from Palestine. Art spaces and organizations in Lebanon have thus far adopted the legal model of nonprofit organizations or associations. They require the implementation of memberships, elections, and are accountable to the Ministry of Interior. The prevalence of the nonprofit model does not therefore imply an expectation of funding or support by the state or other public institutions. These legal structures thus enabled organizations to receive funds or donations from international funding bodies and individuals without the pressure to generate income. Considering the already lamentable state of public institutions dedicated to the arts after the cessation of the Civil War, these organizations primarily sought to promote and help produce contemporary art, therefore replacing the role of the state in this regard. In an essay published by the online platform Ibraz in May 2013, entitled On Being the Other in Post-Civil War Lebanon, Aid and the Politics of Art and Processes of Contemporary Cultural Production, scholar and writer Hanan Touqan looks critically at at the formation of these institutions and spaces and proposes an alternative way of thinking about contemporary art or visual production that have been generated or propelled onto the international art circuit by these spaces over the course of their existence. Touran writes that, quote, in the case of Lebanon, the international support of local initiatives began in the late 1990s and early 2000s to build upon the homegrown initiatives of young Beirut-based artists and cultural organizations active since the early to mid 1990s, end of quote. This kind of new infrastructure that Touran evokes was thus built on the institutional and financial gap left by the state in the wake of the post-war period. Although these organizations remain precarious because of it, and despite any clear vision for funding of the arts, with time they became more established or institutionalized with the emergence of newer and distinct initiatives that propped up in Beirut. Writing in 2009, art critic and writer Kaylin Wilson-Goldie charted the state and evolution of this shaky infrastructure and stressed on the fact that while a lot of significant spaces who were central in the production, curation, and exhibition of art did not have physical spaces to do so. This, quote, spacelessness encouraged artists and curators to engage more meaningfully and directly with the city itself, end of quote. With regard to the launch of the Beirut Art Center within this changing landscape, she also reminded readers that, quote, while it is tempting to read the creating of art spaces as a reflection of increased stability in the country, the situation in Lebanon has in fact been anything but stable of late. This rings even more true today, more than 10 years later, but also so much has changed since then. For one thing, the support of international funding bodies such as the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Institute, along many other American and European funders on which most of the older institutions and spaces have relied for more than a decade, has waned or came to a complete halt because of shifts in cultural policies in the region, more specifically in cities like Beirut, Ramallah, and Amman. This necessitated a change in thinking about different means to sustain these institutions. During this waning period, other newer and younger organizations like Mansion, Temporary Art Platform, and the short-lived and eccentric Aica, the Artist International Workshop in Alay, which is outside of Beirut, 98 Weeks, and Batroun projects, cultivated distinct spaces and programs with little means and often exiguous or challenging physical spaces. There are many reasons why most of the latter spaces no longer exist today, with the exception of Mansion and Temporary Art Platform. Prior to the financial collapse and the Beirut port explosion, these changes spoke to the transience of Beirut, to the displacement and flow of its artists and cultural workers, and to steep hikes in rent and real estate. These ebbs and flows have also allowed other spaces and endeavors to supplant those who did not survive or simply moved on, and they are doing so with very different means, or did so in very different means. Whether or not these means affected the way in which art was being made, formulated, and disseminated was the question at hand. Meanwhile, private initiatives to erect more established traditional museums continued. The large-scale Beirut Museum of Art, BEMA, had been planned for some time and pended the gargantuan funding that it necessitated, and I suppose lost for good. The project was set in motion by the Association for the Promotion and Exhibition of the Arts in Lebanon, a relatively new sort of association, and was set to open in 2020. Other more recent efforts sprung in the few years before 2019 that contributed to an already shifting landscape of art spaces such as the Beirut Art Residency and its sister endeavor, the Cub Gallery, as well as Haven for Artists and Hammana Artist House, both of which represent spaces that did survive the last 2 years. Younger generations of cultural workers and practitioners, some of whom were new to the art world, had turned to the bankers, having not had the opportunity to receive funds from the sort of more established funding bodies. And it was not the first time that such spaces received financial and material supports from banks to fund their activities. The Beirut Art Center had benefited from Société Générale in the past, although not consistently, while other organizations received funds from private donors who were also bankers. So, you know, the question of like bankers is particularly relevant now after the financial collapse and after the sort of mass protests or mass contention that, you know, the local banks were kind of complicit, if not contributed directly to the financial collapse and to the withholding of capital from citizens. So just a few years before the financial crisis, we were witnessing an increased interest by banks, not merely in the material development or financial sustainability of art, but in its participation in knowledge production as well. Beirut Art Residency received its main funding from Banque Med, whose main shareholder is the late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri's family. Founded by Mario Saradar, Chairman and CEO of Mario Saradar and Saradar Bank. The Saradar collection comprises a large number of works by prominent Lebanese modern and contemporary artists. It also launched its own website containing archival and research material, as well as critical or historical essays by local scholars and writers. So the bank's attempts at participating in the discourse of contemporary art revealed a more conspicuous move to become part of the engines that drive the art scene. This perceived informality or non-institutionality of Beirut's older organizations was confronted with the emergence of distinct proposals and agendas in relation to art production and circulation. Of course, the race for funds in the past 20 years had been a prickly issue among contemporary art and cultural spaces because they often vied for the same funding opportunities. Concerns over questions of autonomy towards funding bodies have always loomed large over art spaces in Lebanon, but I would contend also that, you know, it's the same in the region, in Palestine and in Jordan. In the same essay, Touqan reminds us that, quote, Lebanon's contemporary art scene lends itself to a reflection upon the meanings and possibilities embedded within unsupported and commonly understood independent production processes. This is despite the country's lack of a conventional infrastructure of institutionalism and due to Beirut's self-conscious positioning as a space for congregation, debate, and planning, or even as a laboratory, as artists and writers often describe it. End of quote. In Touqan's recently published essay entitled Cultural Wars and the Politics of Diplomacy, which is an edited excerpt from her new book, The Politics of Art, Dissent, and Cultural Diplomacy in Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, the author discusses how the debates on foreign funding, or tamwil al-ajnabi, of the arts in cities like Beirut, Ramallah, and Amman reflect wider discussions on the contentious relationship entertained by the Arab world with the West. She writes that, open quote, this relationship with the West is defined by a discourse that operates in the realm of ideas that have to do with representations and identities that are essentially the byproduct of 200 years of colonial encounters between the Arab world and the West. In the field of the arts, how this unequal relationship of power between funder and recipient materializes is hotly contested. What I mean is how recipients of funds, whether artists or local art supporting initiatives, acting as middlemen with politically vested interests in the region, play a role in shaping the aesthetical and formal practices of cultural production. By extension, how do such initiatives end up influencing the way we understand the role of the artist as a critical voice for change in society? Closed, quotation mark closed. Yes.
Be more done.
I'm almost done. I'm almost done.
Okay.
In her efforts to unpack such debates, Touqan is interested in how dissent is made possible, or in fact impossible, by art organizations on the receiving end of foreign funding, on which they relied almost exclusively for the past 5 years or so, leaving the door slightly ajar for other funders, namely local banks or bankers cum collectors, which the large protest of October 19 also targeted as capital controls became more and more austere, and as the Ponzi scheme they contributed in implementing became more apparent. Although we witnessed the shift in the years preceding the economic crisis, it was short-lived, and not a single art entity or organization, whether old or new, big or small, would think to initiate such close links with those still in power. Like most things in Lebanon right now, it is difficult to measure anything at all. Although the extent of the damage caused by the collapse, which continues to drive away a large number of young artists, writers, and cultural workers out of Lebanon, is felt rather acutely. Both Sadiq and Touqan posit very distinct but productive vectors of thought that summon us to take heed of our roles and responsibilities as artists and art workers that help shape the world and the time in which we live. For even if the city is now dark and bereft, it will not stay this way. In the coming years, in the aftermath of these catastrophes, we should perhaps tread with caution to harness the potentiality of the insurrectionary now, of the uprisings, and carve out generative spaces of critique in contemporary art and the infrastructures that sustain it. For now, we are in the midst of mourning, and as Sadiq reminds us, quote, in Lebanon, there are some who survive and do so in varying conditions and with contrary consequences. As survivors, they nevertheless share the depth of the catastrophe, and as I have tried to argue, are called upon to inherit the underneath of the city. If they do accept their lot, they can, through their descent, keep this place pulsating and palpable. End of quote. Thank you, and sorry for going over time.
No, of course, it's okay. Thank you for sharing. The effects of the political and economic developments in Beirut on the cultural field and announcing it to the world. We have shared your feelings, sadness. Yeah. We have a little time for discussion now. If you have any questions, please push the hand button, which is not an actual button. Raise hand or unmute yourself and ask your question. As I can see, Beral Madra reminds us the first exhibition of contemporary art from Lebanon in Borsan Gallery in 2000. Is there any question or maybe comment? Okay, the first one is okay, Paulo Kane, please.
Oh, hi, thank you. Thanks for your paper, Raya. I was just interested in when Elif introduced you as a student of oral and visual cultures and the references to sound in your CV. And I just found myself, while you were talking, thinking about the sound of the explosion and the sounds of Beirut, and kind of just wondering how you might be responding to the environment in terms of sound. If there's a different kind of report, a different kind of epistemology to be deployed, if you see what I mean. I was just curious about how you personally were responding to that, given your background.
Yes, I see what you mean. You know that it's funny. the event. So the event itself of the kind of the extreme loudness of the catastrophe or the explosion. I haven't really sort of looked at in any sort of from an aesthetic standpoint at all. But what mattered to me were the periods of the pandemic, mostly in Lebanon, where there's a sort of like a deceptive quietness or quietude that kind of resulted from the pandemic, but in fact sort of brought to the surface sort of like the kind of a sort of a state and military apparatus. So you could hear different and even religious apparatuses, right? So, you know, some sermons were given on the streets because, you know, obviously no one was circulating. The military was very present in its kind of sort of its sonic articulation. In the aftermath of the explosion, it was really just about. I mean, I know I'm sort of describing this now, or attempting to translate a particular experience of it, but what was extremely stark, actually, since you know the explosion came right after sort of things started to ease up in terms of like lockdowns and safety measures, and so the city was already sort of quietly emerging, and then there was an entirely new soundscape in which we inhabited. And so what I mostly am interested in is how, you know, different sound artists and different composers have translated or have channeled these experiences through their artistic practices and through their sonic works. Yeah, sorry, I don't know.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. As you were talking, the whole soundscape was kind of coming to me. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beryl Hanım, do you have a question still?
Teşekkürler Elif. Okay, thank you. Raya, you really described the situation so that all over this region, the situation is as you describe it, because we have these wars, terror, and even many other economic problems. Yes, it's a pity, but I'm very sorry that during this COVID period, we couldn't support the artists in Beirut. I visited Beirut in 1997, just after the war. And, you know, I mean, I have seen a city under the shadow of war, but later when I came many times again, I saw the development. So, I mean, everything has changed. The city was restored and the art scene was very, very active. So I made this exhibition in 2000 with Christine Tome, with Ashkar Alvan. And after that, I was always in contact with all these artists. I really followed their very, very interesting productions during the years. And in 2005, a group of art critics and gallerists were invited to our Aica meeting in Istanbul, which was during one of the Istanbul Biennale. So I think, yes, politics and economy are really affecting our art scenes. But how do you think we could collaborate in the near future when, of course, this coronavirus issue is over and we will have a normal life? What do you think we should do together?
Well, I think perhaps you know, calls for solid. I think we just also, we need to be cautious. I think this is the reason why I you know, why I was pulled into Walid Sadiq's kind of like cautionary tale of how an artist can be catapulted onto the world stage and become, as he described these artists, although he didn't fault them or reproach them for having sort of become the sort of tour guides, as he called them, for a convoluted war. I'm quoting him directly here. But I think that you know, that the channels of solidarity already exist, but just need to be concretized, just need to be concretized and seek different avenues for the sharing of knowledge, for the exchange of knowledge, and the exchange of artistic practices, artistic knowledge, because we have a lot to learn from each other from our respective contexts. I mean, most of the things I think that, you know, that I've evoked also, I think many of you in Istanbul are experiencing right now, right? So the devaluation of the currency, etc. And so I honestly don't have a very perhaps intelligent answer to this, but I just know that they need to happen outside of the channels that already exist, whether they are institutional or whether they claim to translate a particular experience to a sort of a global audience. But yes, I also think it is very necessary for these exchanges and for these connections to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We don't have any more time, but if there are any question more, no, I suppose. Thank you. Thank you, Raya Badran, our keynote speaker. We continue then. Now we have two speakers in this session. Our first speaker is Helleboo Zhang. She is a visual artist, writer, and independent researcher. Her works often discuss concepts of time, space, motion, memory, and issues of contemporary urban environment, collective trauma, and forgotten victims in history. She has received an honorable mention in the Monovision's Photography Awards, and her works have been exhibited internationally. Her articles and poems have appeared in Engage, Voice and Verse Poetry Magazine, and others. She's going to give her presentation titled An Antidote to Wartime, Passivity, and Collective Trauma in the 1940s. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Helleboo Zhang. I'm an artist and writer from China. The presentation I will share with AICA Congress today is An Antidote to Wartime, Passivity, and Collective Trauma in 1940s. And now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my presentation?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Everything.
Okay. An Antidote to Wartime, Passivity, and Collective Trauma in the 1940s. The repetition of violent wars in first half 20th century had put in danger the social system of countries engaged in the wars.
Sorry,
not only this.
I'm sorry, could you do it full screen? Maybe it's better. Full screen.
Okay, so
because
you mean
we
that I
can
stop sharing my
read? Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I try again.
Okay. So my presentation today is
So
called
we can't see your presentation paper. Just before is okay, but it didn't. It wasn't full screen. I just. If you can't.
Sorry. So do you mean I share my screen or not?
No, not.
Not. Okay.
Miss Hella, can you share your screen but make it a full screen?
Yeah, exactly.
So we can see it on the entire desktop view. So please share your presentation again and make it into a slide sharing mode, the full screen.
Okay.
Perfect. If you can make it full screen now for each page. On a play mode. Perfect. Thank you.
It's okay.
Yes. Okay. Sorry for that. So I'm going to start again. An antidote to wartime passivity and kinetic trauma in the 1940s. The reputation of violent wars in the first half of the 20th century had put in danger the social system of countries engaged in the wars. Wars not only destroyed the world physically, but also caused severe connective trauma. After living a life of unanticipated horrors and being exposed to the sight of dead bodies, for many people, the pain of war shifted from experience to memory, and external war became internal conflict. Companies uprooted civilians and wounded soldiers wandered in an alienated world. In test inability to move, Michanich diagnosed this pathological zeitgeist and described an emotional incapacity during the post-war period. Many people chose to ignore the painful feelings, but forgetting the traumatic events they had experienced during the war. Society grew more and more indifferent towards death. A feeling of alienation pervaded the post-war world. This research aims to build a bridge between post-war alienation as a psychological state, authenticity as an antidote to post-war alienation, and aesthetic language created to counter this. Post-war alienation is considered as a symptom of connective trauma. Authenticity, on the other hand, can be understood as an antidote, which helps people to channel into the desire of creating an authentic self. The paper will commence by examining connective trauma and the sense of post-war alienation experienced in the mid to late 1940s. It will go on to discuss post-war abstract expressionist artists' aesthetic ideas and to ask how post-war art reacted to post-war trauma. In the field of art history, a large number of literature on the study of abstract expressionist artists discuss the use of Asian symbols from the perspective of resurgence of interest in primitive cultures. The main argument presented in this kind of studies is that modern artists considered primitive society to be an ideal utopian against the highly developed technological society, where mechanized evil and modern horrors emerge. In this essay, I will not focus on this sociological perspective to discuss the influence of primitive culture on the post-war artist's work. Instead, anthropological knowledge about African tribal culture, Hindu-philosophical ideas of Buddhism are important elements in the artwork that will be interpreted in the research. The history of the term alienation within the Western philosophical tradition dates back to Hegel, who set out to explore the philosophical meaning of alienation. The ontological meaning of alienation, according to Hegel, is estrangement and externalization of man's spirit in the world. Here, alienation can be understood as essentially a separation between the whole self and aspects of the self, also between the world of experience as a whole and various aspects experienced through fragmented daily encounter. According to this vision, alienation leads to man's external performance in a state of split and disconnection from his internal essence and authentic self. Despite its Hegelian roots, the significant difference between Marx's theory of alienation and Hegel's is that Marx's conception of alienation lies deeply in the capitalist social system. Marx considered alienation as a process that separates man from the products of his neighbor, and this process occurs when the self is dominated by external force found in industrialized society. It is chiefly applied to the social stage of industrialization, when man's intimate relation with commodities alienated man from his primal relation with the rest of humanity. This implies that the product of man's neighbor is an alien object which he creates over and against himself. His inner world becomes the next belongs to him as his own. By widening the connotation of alienation from philosophical reflection to the social dimension, Marx's critique became an influential theoretical base for the later discussions on the notion of alienation. In the late 1940s and 1950s, academic discussion on alienation reached peak of its popularity. Muchland wrote in The Age of Alienation that alienation is manifested as loss of self, anxiety, depersonalization, rootlessness, and isolation. Melvin Seymour claimed that the dimension of alienation include feeling of powerlessness, social isolation, cultural estrangement, and self-estrangement. Muchland and Siemens' interpretation of alienation extend its philosophical origins to the social psychological dimension and provide a theoretical support for the application of the notion as a feature in the sphere of a given historical period. The interpretation of alienation proves that this notion is related to an individual's psychological condition as well as the culture and social system in which they live, which make it possible for the researcher to apply this term to capture the zeitgeist after World War II and its alienated condition for human survival. So after World War II ended, people were living in an age of pessimism, an age of alienation, an age of uncertainty and spiritual isolation. War survivors may have forgotten the terrible traumatic events that happened during the war, yet huge pain lingered inside their psychic world as unspoken absence in their being. Things that were surrounding them, connecting them with others, and flowing between their internal world and external environment disappear, resulting in alienation and subsequent destructive consequences. From a connective perspective, people in defeated countries experience a strong sense of humiliation after their countries were occupied during wartime. Being separated and alienated from the formal self, an individual's sense of temporal continuity and self-narrative are broken. Past, present, and future are seriously split. With this lack of unified personality and sense of continuity, individuals exist as being and nothingness, since material body had been eroded by nihilism, which recognized its inevitable mortality. Man experienced alienation as another feeling of time, another idea of the event, or of the future that carries with it in another way of referring to the past. It was an era of disillusionment following the destruction of humanity as it was previously conceived. In the late 1940s, when Paris was busy with physical reconstruction after war, New York was filled with vibrance and energy of post-war artists. Thousands of abstract expressionist artists' ambitions were stimulated by the reopened galleries, exhibitions, and art festivals. In June 1943, Gottlieb and Mark Rothko wrote a letter to the editor of New York Times, saying that their paintings aim to destroy illusion and reveal truth. Gottlieb explained later in another statement that when our aspirations have been reduced to a desperate attempt to escape from evil, the so-called abstraction is not abstraction at all. On the contrary, it's the realism of our time. Influenced deeply by extensionist thought, the relationship between abstract expressionists and the extensionist philosophers were direct and close. Abstract expressionists thought that extensionism's conceptualization of authenticity served as a hypothesis, providing an antidote to post-war evil, trauma, and people's alienated existences. Authenticity in existentialism meant a return to an authentic existence and development of an authentic emotion of man. Existentialists claim that by reconnecting with man's inner self, the universal self and the primal self, man could conduct action that condemn wartime passivity. The notion of authenticity created by Kierkegaard and developed by Heidegger was used as a support for Sartre during war times, as Sartre himself had noted in the War Diary. In 1945, immediately following the end of war, Sartre had given a speech called Existentialism is Humanism, where he said that the main aim of existentialism is to bring about a society bounded with authentic individuals and free of oppression. This life philosophy soon became a popular motto among the desperate people during the post-war years. Sartre stated that everyone has the right and freedom to choose, to create, and to redefine himself, instead of surrendering to a broken, alienated state of existence. The authentic individual is the author of himself, who is no longer instrument of capitalism or victim of collective trauma that leads to an alienated self. Here, authenticity can be understood as an opposite of alienation and as an antidote to post-war alienation. Central to this philosophical idea is the bipolar state of post-war alienation and post-war authenticity. These two concepts exist on a continuum. If post-war alienation can be summarized as a symptom of separation of self and external world, authenticity is the recreation of self, a unification, integration, and restoration to the former authentic self-existence. From an aesthetic point of view, authenticity in post-war art means using universal and timeless language to express authentic feelings and to reconnect with primal emotions. For abstract expressionists, expressing authentic and primal feelings was one of the main tasks in the face of depression and trauma of World War II. As Mark Rothko said, it is man's faith in himself, in his own mind, to maintain simultaneously consciousness of himself and his surroundings, which helps man to overcome the lack of unity. Alongside extensionism, Jung's theory were major theoretical base, shaping many of the abstract expressionist value and aesthetic ideas during post-war years. The use of Jung's idea allowed abstract expressionist artists to tap into the subconscious by using unconsciously chosen colors, shapes, and symbols. In this research, primal symbol is the phrase "I created" for the sake of achieving a better understanding of the symbols appearing in these painters' artworks. The definition of this phrase is as follows. A primal symbol is painted by the artist's primal instinct, opening them to the connective unconsciousness, which aims to evoke the viewer's primal emotion and remind them of their primal existence as human beings. The reason that the researcher nominates this as a primal symbol rather than a symbol of primal instinct or symbol of primal emotion is that primal symbol has an overlapping connotation that shares with primitive symbol. The latter is the aesthetic representation often seen in abstract expressionist works and which has been widely discussed in academic research on abstract expressionism. Yet, primitive symbol is a contradictory notion that has been debated for decades. In order to better serve this specific research and to avoid confusion, the researcher created and applied this phrase, primal symbol, to study symbols appearing in the abstract expressionist works. Primal symbol is a manifestation of the collective unconsciousness of mankind, which embodies the soul of humanity at large.
Madame Zhang, I have to kindly warn you about time.
Okay, and so I jump a bit. Two paintings from Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko were chosen as visual materials, not only because they were all painted by painters in 1946, the year after World War II ended, although this fixed variable of having the same creation year for the visual sample grants this research a more representative outcome for post-war academic studies. Aesthetically speaking, these two paintings were chosen because they apply techniques of primal symbolism in various approaches, from figurative primal symbol using primitive totems, human organs, and animals, to abstract primal symbols using kana symbolism, symbolic composition, and arrangement. This endorsed the visual analysis with a broader venue by covering different catalogs of primal symbols. The visual analysis of the paintings will be conducted in order from the abstract work painted by Mark Rothko to the figurative work painted by Adolf Gottlieb. Mark Rothko accompanied Untitled C in 1946. This painting is the work of Mark Rothko in a transitional period where there is a tension between pure abstraction and figurative representation. In the late 1940s, Rothko had used references to biomorphic forms to express the brutal anxiety generated by World War II. The composition of Untitled C is figurative to some degree. The work immediately makes the viewer from a form association with the internal organs of the human body. At the bottom of the column, from left to right of the painting, is an identifiable organ, the human heart. Besides its physical centrality, its correspondence in the undeniable reality with our primal feeling and exists as the heart of the cosmos, amplified in the primal pulsation of the drum. It can be assumed that Rothko put an emphasis on heart symbol by giving it a precise depiction and a photorealistic sense of authenticity, for the reason that he unconsciously wished to build a connection between his authentic emotion and his viewers. Above this symbol is an unidentifiable shape. Yet the disconnection between the shape and the heart symbol is visible. They are all circled by the kana white, which signifies the sacred light and illuminates the whole painting, subtly connecting each symbol with the mysterious white light and energy. With Rothko's extensive use of white accompanied by symbolic elements, Untitled C conveys a sense of coldness by constructing a narrative as if these internal organs are soaked in water tanks filled with anti-corrosive liquids. The symbolic elements seem to be samples for scientific experiments, which remind the viewer of the cruel scenes of horrific scientific research using human subjects, as happened in the concentration camps during World War II. Also, it can be interpreted as Roscoe's construction of an imaginary space for preserving human organs and witnessing the mass destruction by modern technology and machines during wartime. In Untitled C, background color brown can be assumed as having been painted before the rest part of work. This arrangement of background color of brown color, pink, and dynamic effect created by the composition of the human organ and outer white ring surrounding organ can be understood as a representation of human primal existence as a living organism by throwing organs onto the canvas as if they were forced to enter gray and face death. In Untitled C, background color brown can be assumed having been painted before the rest part of the work. The overall pink color saved the painting from falling into depicting post-war horror. The work as a whole does not convey a sense of hopelessness. The feminine energy signified by color pink is a symbol of renewal. Human organs considered within the archive of Jungian archetypal symbolism represent the concept of primal existence, when all human beings exist as self since the beginning of the universe. Jung said in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, the morphological elements of the human body are inherited as primordial body in its original wholeness, and the body parts dismember the primordial unity in the manner of a shamanic initiation of death and rebirth. This life and death motive run parallel with Roscoe's interest in the concept of shamanic transformation. As Weisman wrote that death, making the passage between earthly and transcendent spheres negotiable, is in itself a force for fertility and balance. Nature's continuous transformative process is thereby manifested.
Madame Zhang, are you finished?
No, but I noticed that at the time.
We ran out of time already.
Yes. So maybe a very fast conclusion. There's another painting of Adolf Gottlieb, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to share this painting with you. So through analyzing the visual samples, the research questions were explored further, which are how do post-war art reacted to post-war trauma and help the viewer to cope with post-war alienation. The findings of the research revealed that with the aid of primal symbols, post-war art has the potential to aesthetically produce a holistic sense of going beyond the former alienated self by creating an authentic being. For further studies, different theories about the concept could be explored, such as more comprehensive research result can potentially be achieved. Researchers hope that this study could be taken into consideration as filling a gap in the narrative of post-war study, post-war alienation, and aesthetic language. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your speaking. It was dramatic. We will have time for questions at the end, if I remind of, by the way. Juan Carlos Flores Zuniga is our second speaker in the session, and his presentation will be about art criticism in times of a perennial crisis. But let me introduce him first. He has master in communication and language. He is communicologist, President Críticos de las Artes de Costa Rica. Sorry about my Spanish. art critic affiliated to Aica since 2018, international director of Aica since 2020, university professor, blogger, and author. He has published 4 printed works of visual arts and more than 500 articles on both Latin American and international artistic production in the last 40 years. He runs the Ars Criterion Ezine and coordinates a visual art critic channel on Vimeo and YouTube. He lives in San Jose, Costa Rica, with his wife Orieto Oreamuno and has 3 children. Please, Mr. Flores Zuniga.
Good morning, Elif. Oh, well, here it's very early. I'm very cold. But anyway, thank you for having me. Do you want me to start sharing or wait for a question for my colleague?
No, please start your sharing and start your presentation. After the presentations, we can have a time.
Okay, great. Can you hear me well?
Yes, of course.
Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, don't worry.
Okay, one moment. It's ready. I will try to keep with the time. It's very short, but this is kind of TED Talk. So thank you all for your patience. In Latin America, the complaint about the absence of systematic, professional, and independent art criticism has been very frequent. But when this has taken place, fulfilling these parameters, the general response has been to discredit it and restrict its spaces. The signal that the mass media has been sending globally since the beginning of the century is withdraw. Both the media, artists, and the market have tacitly proclaimed the end of art and criticism as we knew it, and restricted both commentary and professional criticism. For this reason, the following questions should be considered for my essay. Should art criticism exist or not in the contemporary artistic environment? What role does art critic play in times of crisis? And then on what basis should it be articulated? Whether as an art critic, a vocation that I have exercised for 4 decades inside and outside my native country, or as a spectator of traditional or contemporary artistic manifestations, I'm convinced of the need for art criticism because it's the only one that can mediate with criteria, professionalism, and independence between the confusion of the cultural moment that we live in before and during the pandemic, and the work that is produced when interpreting and contextualizing it, empowering the specialized spectator or not to do the same. Certainly, the last century has seen the end of painting, the crisis of the museums, and the end of art, as summarized in 2006 by Donald Kuspitz, for whom art has been replaced by what Alan Kaprow calls post-art, a kind of new visual category that places the banal above the enigmatic, the scatological above the sacred, intelligence above creativity. In Kuspitz criteria, the entropic character of modern art, illustrated particularly by theorists and artists like Marcel Duchamp and Bardet Newman, due to its unsightly emphasis, make postmodernism the final phase of art. At the generation of the preceding exploration of the universal human unconscious into narrow expressions based on temporal, ideological agendas has taken place. He considers that what he calls them the new old masters are the aesthetics and human future in art as a reaction to the emptiness and stagnation of this millennium. As Paul de Man notes, criticism without crisis fails critically. All true criticism occurs in crisis mode. Criticism belongs to the heart of the abysm that constitutes a work of art, the self-reflecting mirror effect by means of which a work affirms by its very existence its separation from empirical reality. Art criticism then has an undeniable sociocultural purpose to fulfill by creating crisis and or interpreting the crisis of art and the current culture. The absence of crisis is the only thing that limits the exercise of criticism and its liberating potential. In fact, even amid the generalized denial and rejection of art criticism by most media, the market, and historians, curators, few connoisseurs doubt about the role of the critic in the middle of an exhibition or an artistic show. As Boris Grove clarifies, the art critic has long seemed like a legitimate representative of the artwork, like the artist, curator, gallery owner, and collector. When an art critic shows up at an opening or some other art world event, no one asks, what is he doing here? That something should be reading about art is taken for granted. When works of art do not have a text in a brochure, catalog, art magazine, or elsewhere, it seems that they have been delivered to the world unprotected, lost, and naked. Images without text are embarrassing, like a naked person in a public space. At a minimum, they need a textual bikini in the form of an inscription with the artist's name and title. At worst, it can be read untitled. Only the domestic intimacy of a private collection allows the total nudity of a work of art. Where then art criticism be found in a hostile environment that restricts freedom of expression by seeking retreat, eliminating spaces in the media to exercise it publicly? The new alternative stronghold is the blogosphere. The libertarian civil discourse of which art criticism is the champion has been transferred to social networks, blogs, video blogs, and channel streaming. In the same way that readers have massively migrated to the internet, breaking the circulation of print media, and viewers have abandoned television channels for streaming television services. The above is not a phenomenon typical of the pandemic because the exodus started many years before, when freedom of expression began to be restricted by the dominant theory in the media of the agenda setting. Nevertheless, the media stopped informing and interpreting what is happening in the environment to selectively inform and interpret only what they think is ideologically interesting in making visible. They created their own reality, but the blogosphere, I believe, established a freer and less manipulable space. Where is art criticism? Sorry. Where is art criticism in the new normal? Not only has it migrated to the blogosphere, but it also speaks to a new generation of viewers and readers, artists and researchers. The principles of online criticism are almost the same as the previous paradigm. What has radically changed is the methodology. It is certainly more demanding than publication in a newspaper or a magazine, but it's greatly compensated by the freedom to communicate without the commercial and ideological pressures of the traditional media linked to the official cultural establishment. In this new context, art criticism continued to be defined as an artigraphic specialty that consists of interpreting and contextualizing the artistic fact. Traditionally, it was limited to evaluating and reviewing works and exhibitions not consecrated by the history of art. This definition, however, is insufficient in the local socio-cultural context and in a globalized world where mimetic, improvised, and even gruesome cultural production is marketed in the same way as work that derives from an artistic discipline, a clear concept, and an honest behavior. It is insufficient in sociocultural environments where ignorance and artistic misinformation are at the order of the day, and where the author, in the absence of a systematic critical demand, turns creative honesty into a matter of individual ethics, subject to variations in fashion, the market, and the official taste of the public. An alternative that enriched the definition of art criticism in our medium is one that considers it a form of literature that condenses or amplifies, emphasizes or orders, or tries to harmonize all the ideas that come to mind when it's confronted by the artistic phenomenon. We owe it to the French poet and critic Paul Valéry that art criticism has progressed from vituperation to metaphysics. This revolution is what explains why we still read art criticism today, even in Latin America. Charles Baudelaire pointed out well that there was not a single moment when criticism was not in contact with metaphysics. To establish a clear foundation, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature, structure, components, and fundamental principles of reality. This includes the clarification and investigation of some of the fundamental notions with which we understand the world as an entity, being, existence, object, property, relationship, causality, time, and space. Paying attention with obstinate rigor to the artistic object is an inherent quality of the professional critic. But our historians and other academics, to turn art criticism into another academic discipline, put a definition of a methodology before the experience of the artistic fact. In other words, they try to turn art criticism into something that is not, like art history or curatorial rhetoric. We cannot confine art criticism to an academic discipline because it will be the end of it. Sorry. We cannot confine art criticism to an academic discipline because it will be the end of it. But we can accept that this literary genre exists due to the artistic object it examines. Criticism is about making decisions as if they matter. Or as critic David Hinckley put it, criticism tries to channel change. And when nothing changes, when nobody disagrees, who needs criticism? As the art critic David Levi-Strauss has noted, without criticism, the only measure of value in art is money. And that measure has proven to be both inconsistent and uncoercive. I understand that bankers and mutual fund managers prefer it, but I don't understand why artists have endured for so long. If art criticism is undervalued, artists and curators will have no choice in the current relative values crisis than to depend on which song the market plays. Therefore, the task of interpreting the contemporary artistic fact, the art critic, because he has criteria, joins the role of the demystifier. This role is often resented by the artistic community that perceive a threat to their economic security and social prestige, as well as by collectors and dealers who do not want evidence of the fragility of the aesthetic proposals that they promote, supported more by the curriculum, the words, and endorsing articles on request. The critic stands as the demystifier, a potential destroyer of false artistic mythologies, at the same time that we discover the false values of appreciation of art, the complacent and superficial that is promoted for the sake of the effort, a deficient cultural production defended, as stated by the Argentinian art critic Marta Traba, by a public that wants to have heroes, even if it's shown that they were cowards, and that keeps local geniuses at all costs after their pages have quickly turned to dust and ashes. The curator, the commentator, the journalist, and the art critic can contribute nothing if they leak the artistic work with lyrical effusions of the third order, reassuring the public and obtaining in return great sympathy from these artists and from certain audiences and media. The healthy and professional art critic in our medium should not seek complicity with lies and superficiality. He must be a witness to the aesthetic truth understood as the sum of knowledge and experiences that allows him to articulate a criterion. As the authentic artist, all this results only from discipline, knowledge, integrity, and courage. Recent history has shown the development of culture from the government level through a promotion of artistic activity financed with public funds and apps being a drag on the very culture that it seeks to establish or promote. In the visual arts, for example, we find that the leadership of the main cultural agencies and training institutions is often in the hands of bureaucrats, whether they call themselves academics in art or illustrious citizens. Their concept of the visual arts is not dynamic nor free. Rather, they neutralize the necessary confrontation between art and public, creating an environment where only the non-controversial author who has a good relationship with the director or a curator of the Gallery of Museum exhibit and is awarded, or failing that, the one with a broad curriculum and awards. So in practice, the artistic work that should be the main thing is relegated. And when it is subject of official comments, it has a lot of anodyne and cliche aftertaste. Why does art need criticism in Latin America or elsewhere? Because criticism reflects it from a distance that serves for reflection, discernment, and connection with a greater world. Of course, an art for art's sake can be produced, and it does. But what is the point of its connection with the real world become tenuous, and the relationship with the social disappears? If an artist and her art want to get hooked on reality, if they want discussion and confrontation, they need criticism. On the other hand, the critic does not produce in isolation. On the contrary, his role leads him to multiple political, social, economical, psychological, and cultural nutrients in which he must research and keep updated. Therefore, the criteria imply discerning the essential from a multitude of data and ideas, seeking to distance themselves from their preference and those of the market. There is, however, a collateral problem in the Latin American context derived from the nutrients of criticism, that is the absence of a critical thinking and sensitivity of his own. The critic, nevertheless, adds his national experience to international reference in the absence of systematic and relevant critical reference in the subcontinent. It should not be surprising that this reality has turned our region in what Octavio Paz called an eccentric portion of the West, which has criticism but lacks critical thinking of its own. Our portion, says the Mexican poet and intellectual, knows satire, irony, humor, heroic rebellion, but not criticism, in the correct sense of the word. That is why we don't know tolerance, the foundation of political civilization, nor true democracy, which consists of freedom and which rests on respect for dissidents and the right of minorities. Our peoples live between the spasm of rebellion and the stupor of passivity. In this context, the exercise of criticism has dangerous connotations, so much that the many critics in different fields, although rigorous and honest, chose to renounce to an interpretative and demystifying activity all the time. If the environment does not favor the development of art criticism, one may ask, why risk practicing systematic and professional art criticism? The answer is that without art criticism, there cannot be a cultural production of universal quality and global influence in our environment. While gratuitous flattery supersedes criteria, the measure of creative integrity is viewer ignorance, and cynics and charlatans dominate the cultural scene, such as bureaucrats of the official taste, unscrupulous dealers, or inauthentic authors. There will be no real quality to note. The critic must remain as free as the artist himself, so that he can face the pressures looking to assimilate him or her into the vested interest, or failing to accomplish that, to remove the art critic from circulation. It is a serious mistake for artists to attack art criticism because this is their own progeny and future, or as Baudelaire put it, it is from the belly of art that criticism is born. More than ever, the integrity, discipline, knowledge, and courage of art criticism is the new normal, and the new spaces of expression is the blogosphere, are the only guarantee that art and its audience have on the validity of what it communicates as an object of his criticism in the visual arts as any other field of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot about your fascinating presentation. We have a little time for discussion. Actually, we don't have as our program, but if you have any question, we can take one or maybe two. As far as I can see, there are no any question in the chat box, but No, I suppose. Oh, okay. Please, Paul, okay, please.
Yeah, I had a question that might relate to both the presentations. I don't know if this will work, but when Helleboo was speaking about authenticity and alienation, I was kind of interested in the way that we would continue to justify this idea of being alienated today, but we might no longer sort of justify the idea of being authentic. That we, like today, we might sort of readily say that we are alienated, but we might less readily say that we're authentic. It's something to do with a sort of postmodern or post-structural kind of understanding of ourselves, sort of beyond authenticity. And I don't know if this maps across to Juan Carlos's presentation, but when Juan Carlos was speaking, I was still kind of concerned and wondering where the authentic critic emerges and who gets nominated as the valid critic in the blogosphere, etc. I don't know if that question works, but it sort of spans both papers in a way.
Yeah.
Ellen, you can start, and then I completed the question from Paul.
Okay, is there any question more? No, I think. Okay. Brew writes the question, can Juan Carlos elaborate more on the role of Weblogs in art criticism today? Says. Yes. Very short. Yeah.
Thank you, Elif. I will first address what Paul said, because he's very right in one point. Who decide you are the authentic critic that is positioned to give opinion or judgment or pass judgment or criteria on an artist or his artwork? I think that not depend actually on the scenery or the culture, but the people who dare to do it. In my context, it's like this. I don't know how it's in your place, but in Latin America, those who dare to give an opinion have to sustain it with their lives. I'm not talking about dying, even though I'm being persecuted, hid at the entrance of an exhibit, spit out and everything, even demanded at the courts. But beside that kind of opposition and consequence of the work you do, actually what keeps you moving is courage, the conviction that you have that what you do add value to culture and society. I think I see that Baudelaire in a sense that art and criticism are brothers and sisters. They are cannot be separated. When the artist separates criticism, he actually is not producing authentic work. Why? Because when you expose yourself, you expose to the opinion of others. Art is not created in an incubator. It's not isolated from context or people. Actually, creating art in an island like Robinson Crusoe won't be considered art. The meaning of art being assigned by being confronted and exposed and circulated in terms of value or currency among other people, their fellow peers, whether they know or whatever. Something I want to say is this. At the end of the 19th century in France, something that was very common culturally was that everybody has to have an opinion on art, whether they write or not about it. It was part of their upbringing. If you were a person, educated person, you have to give an opinion about art. In our context, most people don't dare to give an opinion or pass an opinion on what they are seeing. They just accept first face what the person, the curator or the historian or the people in the catalog say, or what the artist say. Nobody question it. And people say, oh, beautiful, oh, nice. But nobody really dared to question that. At the end of the 19th century, everybody has an opinion. Now people don't have opinions. People are very profoundly prudent about giving opinions. So I think the people who dare to give an opinion have the right to be a critic because they are living with the consequences of their opinions, whether they are educated or not, informed or not. I think for me, authenticity is that the weight of your words have to carry a weight, and that weight has to be on you. You cannot blame anybody else but yourself for giving that opinion, whether it's informed or whether it's not. So I think really critics emerge out of narcissism, a good narcissism, and also from courage. Otherwise, they cannot be in this scenery. They cannot stand for 40 years like me. And I think that's not something to feel proud of, because my family hate what I do because of the consequences. But I have to explain them every day that it's worth it, that it really make a difference, that people can be benefit from the exchange, because that's what free discourse and civil discourse is about. Sorry.
It's a great inspiring answer. It's quite romantic and heroic. It takes us back to Baudelaire, but I like the answer.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know about the second question, because right now I have short memory lapses. So would you mind to help me, Elif?
Please. And also Beral Hanım has a question. Please unmute yourself.
And
I open my chat and I cannot see it.
No, I was very, very happy to hear, Juan, what you were presenting us, because you really described what is really happening in the global art world, particularly with its relation to the art market, global art market. But let me give you an information from the local scene. Today, one of our very important senior theater actor, Genco Erkal, was in front of the court just today because he criticized the president's some announcement. And yes, he was supported by a large group of people in front of the court building, but he was, I mean, he was in danger, as you have described. And for the moment, over 200 journalists are in jail in Turkey. So we have a huge problem, and this really affects the art criticism, because if you start with your art criticism and put into it a political vision or a political insight, then you are in danger in Turkey.
Beral, I feel very close to what you say. I really empathize with what happened in Turkey, because here in my country, even though we say we live in a democracy, when it comes really to face some hard issues, there is no such a freedom. I mean, people curtail you. Let me put this together with the blogosphere question. Why the blogosphere is something expanding and expanding like a never-ending universe? Because actually the current media is more controllable, is more manipulable. I work in journalism for 30 years. I teach journalism at the universities here. And I noticed how journalists have decayed in terms of defending their own freedom. They have the freedom to be the mediators of people and their governments, for instance, or between culture and the people who receive it or produce it. But actually they renounce that and they decide to become officials of the government, the official line. If you are in the official line, you get the pricing, you get the honors, you get the position. But if you defy them, if you dare to say something just different, even respectful, it won't be accepted. Our culture is moving forward in a position where civil discourse is disappearing. The art criticism is one of the last disciplines where you can exert real freedom. Why? Because most of the realms of professionalism or professions or activity or disciplines are confined to comply. Actually, they self-censor themselves. Of course, there is censorship, but actually people rather self-censor themselves because it's more comfortable and they make a living. So that's why I distrust so much the cultural establishment and the culture that is promoted from the government spheres. Usually we have official artists in my country, and in most countries I visit in Latin America, they have their official country, their official sculptor, their official painter, their official etcher, people who is official. So it's actually like they have monuments that are untouchable. And when you dare to touch them, everybody's gonna be against you. So you have to pay a price for being free. Freedom don't come in a cornflakes. It's not something that is a token that you can take anytime. It's something that you earn by exerting freedom with what you do. And very daring from the journalists in Turkey, as everywhere else, that dare to question. That's the role, and that's the role of the art critic as well. Freedom of expression is our must. Thank you, Beirut.
Thank you. Madame Zhang, would you like to answer the question of Paul Quain? Okay. Or maybe, yeah, okay, please.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. And now we are really at a time that reminds us of World War II, because wars and COVID are both like dark ages or dark time of human evolution in our history. And we are all like shadowed by this traumatic experience. And this collective trauma left some shadows in our individual psyche. So the role of art and what artists need to do is to like connect with the viewers or the media or the world, the outside world, with their authentic emotions and authentic expressions. So this connection is vitally important, is very important at this age. And the key concept in my research and presentation is the symbolism, how people connect with each other in terms of symbol, and how symbols can heal or transcend, create a transcendent experience. So this harnetic sense of experience created by symbols, and primal symbols especially, are something we need to learn from the post-war artists. So yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's great to hear all this authentic passion for the authentic.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to ask or add? Okay. I think we are good for now. It's time to close the session. I want to thank everyone. It was a pleasure being with you all today. To our audiences, you can keep participating next session, which is at 4 p.m. After the break time. And I mean local time. You should check the full program for tomorrow also. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for your time.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.